Well, good afternoon, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be here. I wish I could speak to you in Korean. Unfortunately, I think, too old to learn a language as difficult as Korean. But it is a great pleasure and honor to be here this afternoon, and I am grateful to the National Library for the invitation to speak here.
사실 머피 교수님은요, 여러 외국어를 하세요. 프랑스어도 하시고, you can speak French, right?
Oui, je peux parler en français. S'il y a beaucoup de gens qui parlent français, nous pouvons.
Yeah,
So I am also honored by the fact that the National Library has recognized my book. And of course, I am here this afternoon to talk about this book, which originally was, so the book was originally published in English under this title, Geography, Why It Matters. But it's a book that I have been fortunate enough to get some international recognition of the book in the form of translations, first into Spanish, that was done in Madrid, then in Chinese, which was done by Peking University Press, and then, thanks to Professor Kim, into Korean, which of course is the version that may be most accessible to you. And there's an Italian translation coming out in a couple of months. Not only does the Korean version have the best cover, the English language has the worst one. I'll explain that later. But not only does it have the best cover, but I think the Korean version is the version that has actually, in some ways, been the most successful of the translated versions. So Professor Kim sent me this photograph from a bookshop, I think here in Seoul, which shows that they were making an attempt to actually raise awareness of this book here. So my regular job for the last 35 years has been to be a professor of geography at the University of Oregon. I think that was part of the introduction. This was where I spend a good deal of my time. I think a good photograph to show in a library because you can see how much I value books. But to talk about the book, explain the book, I want to talk a little bit about what prompted me to write the book. Let me first just tell you just for a minute about how I even became a geographer, because it was not something that I initially started out to do. When I entered university, I did not know quite what I wanted to do. I ended up going to Yale University and I studied archaeology because I was interested in some of the things I had experienced when I was traveling to different parts of the world. Then, even when I finished my undergraduate, I still wasn't quite sure what I wanted to do. I ended up actually spending a year in Germany, but then coming back and thinking international law. I was interested in the world. International law. So I enrolled at Columbia University Law School, and I finished my law degree there, and I practiced law for a couple of years, but courses I took in international and comparative law at Chicago got me interested in geographical questions, like why did different approaches to law develop in different places? How did they diffuse from one place to another? And that eventually led me to leave the practice of law and pursue a PhD in geography at the University of Chicago.
콜롬비아 대학이 우리 머피 교수님께는 지리학도 얻고 또 사랑하는 아내도 만난 약간 행운의 장소가 아닌가. The Columbia Law School is a very good place for you. You met your wife and you met your destiny geography, right?
Indeed. Yes. I understood what you were saying when you were right. The best thing about going to law school.
네, 로스쿨에서 찾은 가장 훌륭한 보물은 사모님이다라고 이렇게 멘트해 주셨습니다.
And my wife then joined. She has been a longtime professor of law also at the University of Oregon. So we had joint careers there. Yeah. But I tell you this because I came to geography it's true. I knew about geography because of my father, but I came to it gradually because I began to increasingly be aware of how much geography can open our understanding and minds to the world in which we live and our place in the world in which we live. So, of course, I did many of the things in my career that a professor at a research university would do. But all of these, in some senses, led me to this book. So one thing I did was do sort of traditional academic research, particularly in political geography. Ever since I wrote my dissertation on the division of Belgium along language lines and how this affects people where they live, their identities, their senses of self, to geopolitical questions, I kept thinking we often aren't asking the right questions unless we think geographically. And then there are things that I was doing as a teaching professor, of course, giving classes, always being excited when I felt like I could introduce a student, not just to a subject, but a way of thinking that was different from what they had been exposed to before. And I also translated this into some contributions to textbooks that I have authored or co-authored, including one with Harm de Blay, who is a geographer who visited Korea in the past. So, of course, also when one is involved in a professorial position, one of the things that you're involved in is service and outreach activities. And I was given the opportunity to share some of my work with people in different parts of the world, from Iran to Gabon in West Central Africa, and also eventually in my career to have the chance to serve as the president of the American Association of Geographers. My hair was not as gray in these pictures. So, but whatever I was doing, I became increasingly aware that we need to think about the world in more complicated ways, more geographically aware ways than just the typical map that we put up on the walls of our classrooms. A map that even is sometimes substituted for the knowledge of a map that is sometimes substituted for actual geographical thinking about the world. You know, do you know where Mexico is? It's a good question. It's one that I hope people can answer, but it's not itself an insightful question that helps us understand the world. I do want to emphasize that it's nice when people get these things right. This one, I hope, will elicit laughter. These geographic mistakes.
여러분 웃으셔야 됩니다. 여기서 지리 문명이 아님을 입증하시려면 웃으셔야 됩니다.
But of course, geography is much more than memorizing place names. So some of the things that really deepened my understanding of what geography could contribute, and that I even used as examples in my book, came from opportunities to participate or even chair studies that were done by the National Research Council of the U.S. Academy of Sciences. But I also tried to use the opportunities I was given to do things like lead the AAG, to encourage academic geographers to speak more to the outside world and help them understand the importance of geographic thinking and geographic understanding. So this was all the backdrop to an invitation that came to me just a few years ago by a Cambridge, England press, Polity Press, which had started a series of books. They called it the Why It Matters series. And the idea was to write books that would be accessible to a more general audience, maybe students who are interested in subjects, or general audience, general members of the public who would be interested in why should we study history? Why should we study anthropology? Why should we study biology? I was asked to write the book on geography. why it matters.
세계 지리학계를 대표하는 지리학자를 지금 만나고 계신 겁니다. 다 같이 박수 한번 보내주시겠어요?
Because the book was part of a series and they were using different colors for each book in the series, I had no choice about my cover. I was given a simple pink color, which I don't particularly like, but it does stand out. So, what did I do in the book to try to explain what geography can bring to our understanding of the world around us? I think there were at least 4 things that I tried to emphasize. One of those is to try to see what can be learned by trying to analyze the spatial organization or the spatial patterns that one finds on Earth's surface. And these can range from the small scale, a famous study done in London in the middle of the 19th century that proved that cholera was a waterborne disease because all the cases were clustered around there, to global studies that help us understand something about where areas are affected by migration, where are they not, what does it mean to be in places that are more or less affected by migration. And now with geographic information systems, we can look at the relationship between lots of different variables and how they play out in a given place. So a second thing that I think geography is useful in helping us to think about our planet is it encourages our consideration of how lots of different things come together to make places, regions, landscapes, environments, what they are. You know, so often we study one particular subject, another particular subject, another particular subject, but what about how things come together to create the contexts that shape the physical environment and the human environment? I used 2 photographs I've taken in different places, one in the Alps to illustrate the physical environment. And yet it's not just a physical environment. There's also human elements, and it's understanding of how those work together that actually helps us understand this place. Or a much more humanized place, like Mostar in Bosnia-Herzegovina, meeting place of world religions, place, unfortunately, of conflict, that is a product both of its physical and human characteristics. A little while ago, I was asked to give a talk on Istanbul. And I was thinking, how do I explain this place? And I realized you cannot explain a place like Istanbul without reference to its physical environment, its location in relationship to other places, of course, and its political, cultural environment. So it really brought home to me that we need to be thinking about places in integrative ways that include all those elements as well as how people think about places. This is part of modern geography as well. How we think places should be influences how they develop and change over time. I also was interested in the book in trying to convey another way in which geography looks at the world, which is to try to understand how the places, environments, circumstances in which things happen influence what happens. I used 2 extreme examples of photographs I've taken, one of a suburb of Phoenix, Arizona, and one in northern Togo. And it's an extreme case to illustrate that what can happen and what does happen in these different environments is much influenced by the character of the environment itself, not just physical environment, but cultural environment, social environment, economic environment, and the interconnections between that place and other places. So sometimes I think we don't think carefully enough about how a place is organized. We don't think carefully enough about the implications, the impacts of organizing a place in a particular way for all sorts of things. So this is just an example of a suburban development outside of Washington, D.C. You can look at it and you could say, oh, here's a picture with some houses. But what does it mean to organize a suburb this way? It means lots of things economically, socially, and environmentally. So social, it's obvious, everybody living a little bit apart. But think about the fact that if you live in this house and you want to go shopping, your only way to go shopping is to get in a car and to come out here and then to go out here and then to go out on a big street, which means that you don't have people able to walk short distances to buy their food. They have to get in a car. This in turn means big stores develop along big streets. If we start thinking these ways, we see how one thing affects the other on the surface of the earth. So the fourth and final major point I want to make that I tried to make in the book about geography is the concept that where something happens affects what happens. Sometimes we can learn things by generalizing across space. Like many economic studies will do something like higher wage here as opposed to a lower wage here means people will move from one place to another. But the problem is human beings are more complicated than that, right? They're influenced by all sorts of things about the character of individuals, by their perceptions, by their culture, by all sorts of things. So it's really important to think about the importance of whether it's trying to understand the physical environment. A landslide in this environment will mean something different from a different environment, or whether you're trying to understand the impacts, let's say, of a new suburban development around Kyoto as opposed to Kuala Lumpur. In Kuala Lumpur, it's very centralized. More suburban development means longer commuting to get into the center. Here, it may mean shorter commuting to get into a place where you're working. So it depends on the place. So the importance of thinking about how where something happens affects what happens came home to me 15 years ago when many of you will remember there was an uprising in Tunisia initially that gave rise to a series of protest movements throughout the Arab world. And it was called the Arab Spring. Well, some people were trying to say these are all reactions to authoritarian rule. And that's right up to a point. But to really understand what was going on, you have to take into consideration that in some places, the uprisings were much more serious than other places. Why? Not because of a difference in authoritarianism, but as these photographs that I took illustrate, a difference in the degree to which the rulers had actually invested locally in the development of the places that are illustrated in these photos. So these are the four things that I tried to develop in the main chapters of my book on space, on place, on human-environment interactions. But to get a sense of how important these are in thinking about the contemporary world, it's useful to think for a minute about how geographic ideas and concerns and understandings can produce better understanding of these kinds of things that are on the slide in front of you. So I use examples throughout the book of these various ways of trying to understand the world geographically. Let me just illustrate now on each of them a couple of examples that will show you why I think geography is so important to understanding our world. So this map, which is not a map that I particularly like. In fact, I think it's not a good map. But this map was very influential for quite a long time, still is to some degree, in how people think about the world. It's a map that came from the work of a political scientist trying to understand the major geopolitical regions of the world. And I remember first looking at it as a geographer and saying, what are you losing sight of if you think of all this green space as one geopolitical region, which is what was happening in the scholarship of this Harvard political scientist? So one of the things that you do as a geographer, if you're interested in spatial matters, is you think critically about space. What's hidden and what's revealed when we look at a particular issue or problem in a spatial way. What's missing here are all sorts of things that actually undercut the idea that the green space is one significant, unified, more or less, geopolitical node. So what you're ignoring, of course, are the great both religious and linguistic differences that one finds in the greater Middle East. What you're also missing, of course, is the existence of very different kinds of regimes in this part of the world, many of which have actually been in opposition to one another, as can be seen on this map of conflict in the area, in the region, in the late 1990s and early 2000s. And just think of the events of the last 3 or 4 days. So if you're not thinking geographically about what's going on right now in this area, it would be more difficult to understand why, for example, the Iran's response to the most recent, not just Israeli, but US bombing did not involve closing the Strait of Hormuz, which would have been the most obvious response. But if you're not thinking about the degree to which the Iranian economy is dependent on selling oil to China, for example, and what that would mean for the Iranian economy to close the Straits of Hormuz, then you miss actually some of the things that are shaping how geopolitical actors in the region like Iran are responding to the current situation. Even at the country scale, we so often miss important things. If we just think about a place like Iraq, for example, as one brown space on the map, and not recognize, as was really not given adequate attention at the time of the invasion of Iraq in 2003, of the internal ethno-cultural diversity in Iraq and the relationship between where people lived and the resources that were there. So there was no thinking in the early going about some kind of revenue sharing arrangement. Because this kind of way of thinking, the relationship between resource patterns and cultural patterns, was not given adequate attention. So how about in the environmental arena? Here too, geography's concern with both spatial arrangements and the integration of the human and the physical offers really important insights. For example, understanding the natural climate system helps us understand how much the human impact has changed the natural system. The work of geographers trying to reconstruct past environmental circumstances, which is done by mapping out areas of different vegetation from the past, which we can tell about because you take cores of lakes and you look at the pollen in different levels and you can see what kind of vegetation existed. This is playing a major role in the climate models that we can now use to understand what's going on in the world. The study I chaired for the National Academy of Sciences had many examples that were really showing how important geographic thinking was to understand the environmental challenges we face. Here's one example done by two geographers at Rutgers University. They weren't just saying, here is where drought will be. They were saying, what about areas not just where drought will be, but where there's also reliance on one agricultural crop, as opposed to multiple crops that some of which can withstand drought better than others. Double exposure, they called it. And these will tell us where areas are particularly vulnerable to climate change. And then there's a study done by Natalie Cook, a geographer at Syracuse, where she's thinking geographically about the whole turn of many cities and places towards a green agenda. And she's trying to look at to what extent is the green agenda really green? So she uses Doha as an example where it claims now to be a leading city for green, environmentally sensitive future. And yet one of the green projects is to plant lots of trees. The problem is, in an environment like Doha, to plant trees and keep them alive, these are ones leading from the airport, requires lots of fresh water. The fresh water can only be made through desalination plants in this area, which are incredibly environmentally problematic, difficult, because they require lots of energy. So what it claims to be green is maybe not so green, and we think about places in a rich geographical way. It's what allows us to get at those complexities. So what about the third challenge? There are all sorts of socioeconomic and health challenges going on in the world. And again, geography has an important role to play in understanding these. There was a widely circulated book some years ago called The World is Flat, making an argument that, well, we increasingly live in a world where people in one part of the world aren't just in contact and dealing with and even in competition with people in the surrounding area, but people halfway around the world. That's true up to a point. But as this map reveals, it's time travel to major cities. There are big parts of the world that are not part of the flat world. And unless we understand that, we actually don't appreciate the circumstances that are shaping the lives of people in different places. So at other scales, geographical approaches can tell us much as well, whether it's studies of health in different places or studies designed to show us how the environment might be changing, so simulations of what's to come, or even studies showing us how people move around in cities, what areas are particularly used and not used. These are all incredibly important in making good planning decisions. So when we come to the policy arena, how geography can contribute to policy, I think many of the prior examples already show this. But there's all sorts of ways in which geographical analysis can lead to better policy making on a variety of things. For example, just this animated map, these animated maps of fire in the western part of the United States can help a lot in terms of forest management and fire policy, seeing the differences between the lightning-started fires and the human-started fires. So my last segment of why geography matters, why we should care about geography, is the most broad. But it was my favorite chapter to write for this book. And I titled it, Why We All Need Geography. And it's really a call for the importance of geography in education and in the wider world, because of geography's importance in shaping people's lives and their understandings of the place we all call home, which is our planet. So a few of the basic points I make. One of them is just how geography and geographic education can promote awareness, can promote understanding of the wider world. If you know something about a place, its people, its environment, you're much more likely to care about it. So whether it's deforestation in the Amazon, or maybe some social turmoil that's going on in Afghanistan, if these are just abstract labels, it's hard actually to identify with them. But if you know something about them, you're more likely to care about them, which in turn, I think, is one of our best hopes for a more peaceful planet. So I think our ability to convey geography and its insights can come in part by telling stories about places that make them more real, that give students a sense of their characteristics, how they are similar, how they are different. It's one of the reasons that in the books that I have written for classrooms and textbooks, even if they're not the best photographs, I like to use my own photographs because then it allows me to tell stories about those places in ways that maybe give a student a sense of, oh, what would it be like to actually be there? Because the guy who's writing about this didn't just do it sitting at a desk, did it because he's had some experience in these places. Just as a side note, one of the benefits I have of being able to come here to Korea now is to be able to actually visit some parts of Korea. Over the last week, I was down in Busan and then Gyeongju and then Andong in this area. And now I have more and better stories to tell about this part of the world. So a second reason I think that we all need geography is because we tend to have stereotypes of different parts of the world that often are not very accurate. And it's important to challenge these stereotypes.
선물 하나 걸게요. 이 사진이 어디에서 찍힌 건지 알아맞히는 분께는 저희가 상품 드리겠습니다. Please guess. Be silent, be silent.
But you have to know, the only thing you have to know is that the woman in the middle of the picture in a chador is the chairman of the geography department.
지리학과 학과장이시랍니다. 저 여성분이. 검은색 차도르를 쓴 여성분이.
So I only tell my students, I say, the only thing I will tell you is that I'm somewhere in the greater Middle East and she's the chairman of the geography department.
자.
And I say, where was this photo taken?
자, 어딜까요? 어디 계세요? 나와주세요. 이란. 어떻게 하셨어요?
So culture
Wow.
look at the language. It looks like looks like Iran language.
Yeah.
And I see the shape of the building looks like Iran.
Right.
와, 다시 박수. 네. 여기 아마 우리나라에서 가장 지리학에 정통하고 지리학자 자질이 많은 분이 오신 것 같습니다. 보통 이거 하면 10개국 정도 나오거든요.
So this was taken when I was visiting the University of Isfahan. And I use this example because students have heard stories, my students in the United States, they've heard stories about the role of women in Saudi Arabia. This was particularly 15, 20 years ago. I was there about 15 years ago. They heard about the role of women in Saudi Arabia. And they then just assume, well, that's the same everywhere. At the time in Saudi Arabia, it would be very unlikely to have a woman chair of a geography department. In Iran, not so unlikely. That's not to say there aren't gender issues in Iran. There are. But it is not particularly unusual at the time I took this photo to have a woman chair of a geography department in Iran. And it helps to destabilize the stereotype they have of, just what's true in Saudi Arabia is true also in Iran. So it's also important to challenge the stereotypes we have about how we think about the world's organization. And one of these is influenced by a navigation map that's a very poor map in terms of showing actually spatial relationships. It makes Greenland look to be about the size of Africa, when in fact you could put all these countries and regions in Africa and still have room to spare. Now I will show you, and the heading, Broadening Horizons, my favorite cartoon. So it shows a woman walking outside with her son. She says, see, this is called the outdoors. And the son says, I've seen this level on my video game. An interesting book was written recently called The Lost Art of Finding Our Way. And it's about how, even though now we all have maps on our cell phones and in our cars, GPS maps, they show us a route. It's very convenient. I use them, of course. But what we often fail to do is to look around, to look at the context around, to actually try to realize that what we're seeing around us is enriching, and it gets us thinking, and it makes life more interesting, rather than just walking down the street like this. And so it's, I think one of the ways that teaching of geography can be useful is it can encourage students to look around. It broadens their horizons. And then finally, I think geography is so important because it can help people have the tools, the intellectual tools, to think critically about what they see and what they hear. You know, the famous early American statesman Thomas Jefferson is said to have remarked that education is critical for a democratic society. Well, I think that is right. If education is critical to a democratic society, what do we need to know? Well, I would argue we need to know something about how the world is organized, how and why places are different, what it means to be in different places. And a great example of why it's important to have some geographical understanding came home to me a few years ago when the New York Times did a study at the time when North Korea was testing missiles, and lots of concern about what this would mean. Obviously in South Korea, also in the United States and elsewhere. And some were saying, we need military action against the North Koreans. And others said, we need diplomacy. So the New York Times did a survey of a bunch of Americans. They said, where is North Korea on the map? And most of the people who knew more or less where North Korea was, diplomacy is probably better. After all, you're so close to Seoul and so forth. The people who thought North Korea was kind of over here, they were much more in favor of, well, let's just drop a bomb or something like that. It was a great example of how geographic understanding actually gives you the tools to make sense of something that's going on in the world.
여러분, 제가 여기 번역자로서 조금 더 추가해 드릴게요. 여러분, 토마스 제퍼슨 집안은요, 대대로 지도를 만드는 지도제작자 집안이었어요. 어찌 보면 education에 가로 열고 geographic education이라고 해도 될 만큼 Thomas Jefferson was a family from mapmaker, right? Mapmaker family.
Correct.
So he knows how geography is important.
So when this article was being researched for the New York Times, I was traveling in Turkmenistan, but I was contacted by the New York Times for a comment on this. I talked to them for about 15 minutes, but the quote that they took from me, that they included in the article, I think speaks to this theme. The paucity, that is to say, the lack of geographical knowledge, means there is no check on misleading public representations about international matters. So let me just end with a few things that you know, but that I think help to bring home for this place the importance of geography, why it matters. Obviously, Korea is situated in a complex geopolitical environment, and one that is challenging. Understanding something about that geopolitical environment, its locational characteristics, but also what it means in terms of relationships with the United States, with Japan, with China, and so forth is critical. And then, of course, the changing economic circumstances, for example, the significant rise in the trading relationship between Korea and China over the last couple of decades, understanding not just that it has happened, but even some of the details about the products and the circumstances that surround this is obviously of importance. And then, of course, there is what geography, with its concern about how the human and the environment are related, can tell us about environmental challenges here, some of which are significant. Korea has one of the most amazing stories of rapid development of the entire world at any time over the last few decades. But that has sometimes been at the expense of the environment. And now one of the challenges is a more environmentally sensitive approach. Human environment thinking, the connections between the two is key for that. And then, of course, there's the insights that geographical analysis can provide to understanding the kinds of challenges that Korea, like so many other countries, face with, for example, internal inequalities in levels of socioeconomic well-being.
그러니까 뭐 우리가 경제적 불평등을 완화해야 된다, 뭐 이래야 된다, 말은 화려합니다, 정치인들이. 하지만 구체적으로 어떤 고소득자들이 어디서 사는지, 그리고 어디가 소외된 지역인지를 지도를 통해서 파악을 하고 정책을 실행해야 보다 효율성 있는 그런 대책이 나오지 않을까 싶은 거예요. 제가 강남을 보면 너무나 촘촘하게 그 전철역이 있잖아요. 근데 저 먼 정말 전철이 필요한 사람들이 사는 곳은 전철이 없잖아요.
So Korea is a relatively small country, but now one with a global reach. I'm still amazed how much the cultural impact of Korea now is evident in my own country, whether it's food or television or music or movies, what have you, but also economically, obviously, and as well as politically. So in this environment, to be a country of this sort, it's incredibly important to understand where this country is situated in relationship to the wider world, which makes geography and geographic understanding particularly important here. So I will end with two statements. One from the study I chaired for the National Academies of Science in the US, which I think had a very important ending to the report that we produced. They argued that what we need is an increasingly sophisticated, well-organized, and powerful geographical science that is embedded in a progressively more geographically enabled world. What is geographically enabled world? A world where people actually understand geography. They think about geography. They have access to geographical ideas and tools. And in my book, I put it maybe in a different way, but a simpler way, but it's the same idea. I try to make the case that in our fast-changing, interconnected world, geographical understanding is not a luxury, it's a necessity. Well, thank you very much for coming this afternoon. I hope it has been an interesting experience for you. I know it's been a bit long, and I am grateful for your attention and for the opportunity to be here. And let me express publicly my appreciation to Professor Kim Ije for translating my book and promoting my book here in Korea. It means a great deal to me.
Thank you. 여기 제가 한 분만 지금 꼭 소개하고 싶은데요. 이 책을 만드신 편집자분이 지금 막 달려오셨거든요. 그래서 좀 앞으로 잠깐만 나오셔서 이 책의 부제가 세계는 지리로 작동한다는데 잠깐 나오셔서 인사 좀 궁금하지 않으세요, 여러분? 이 책을 만드신 분 인사해 주시면 될 것 같아요.
진짜 보여주는 마음과 오랑이라고 하고요. 팀스크립션 굉장히 지금 교수님께서 설명을 주셨는데, 지리학이라는 게 말씀해 주셨듯이 굉장히 다른 학문들은 일반화시키는 게 많은데, 이 학문은 다른 학문과 달리 차이랑 다양성에 대해서 보여주는 학문이고, 이 책은 이런 환경과 공간이 얼마나 사람을 많이 운명을 바꿀 수 있는지, 많은 차이와 다양성을 보여줄 수 있는지, 그리고 가장 기초적인 사실관계를 알려주는 책으로서 정보가 되게 얇은 책인데, 지금 다이제스트가 잘 들어가 있는 책입니다. 그래서 만약에 지리학 이 강연을 들으시고 조금 더 관심이 있으시면 이 책도 한 번 관심을 봐주시면 좋을 것 같습니다. 감사합니다.
네.
한 가지 질문 좀 드리겠습니다.
네네네.
초반에 벨기에 저희 언어에 관련된 전공 연구를 하신 게 있다고 해서
네네.
저희는 이제 남북이 지금 분단되어 있는 상황이고 문화적인 차이가 굉장히 많기 때문에 그 부분을 혹시 좀 읽어볼 수 있는 글이라든지 연구 자료가 있는지 좀 여쭤보고 싶어요.
I'm especially interested in your PhD research about the linguistic distribution in Belgium. So if you recommend some good books, and then she'll be happy to read.
Right. Well, actually, I did publish the book, the dissertation. I published it as a book, University of Chicago Research Geography Series. So it's called The Regional Dynamics of Language Differentiation in Belgium. The basic idea of the book is that so often we talk about the modern language regions and we just make generalizations about them. Flanders, Wallonia. We say, what happened in these regions? How did these regions develop such strong antipathy, such strong sort of difficulty with each other? What this misses is that these regions, the creation of these regions, is actually part of what created the problem to start with. So Belgium had lots of local identities, but it was imagining itself as a French-speaking state. And so it started to impose French everywhere. And the non-French speakers said, even though they were not thinking of themselves as one people, they started thinking, why are we being required to speak French, to use French in our schools? And so they form a movement, and they are not having much success in getting policy changes. So then they say, okay, we need a separate territory. And then they create a territory. Now it's a federal system. And the creation of that territory has now led to a whole set of changes that you don't understand if you just take the territory for granted. You have to think about it geographically, how it came into being, how it reflects and how it shapes things. And to me, that's the basic story I was trying to tell in the Belgian case. There is a famous article written actually about Belgium called The Making of Flemings and Walloons. And it's about how people acquired these identities. And my study is a bit of a complement to that, showing it's not just a cultural process, it's also a political territorial process that creates this. So that was the essence of what I was trying to address in my doctoral dissertation. But just a quick follow-up comment to make it beyond Belgium, because many people don't necessarily focus on Belgium. But one of the ways that geography, I think, can provide insight into the world is not just taking like cultural groups or political states for granted, but actually looking at the circumstances that one kind of territorial arrangement can affect identity, and identity can affect territory. So, for example, France. Okay, it's a place on the map. Who lives in France? The French. Who are the French? 1,000 years ago, people living in northern France and southern France did not think of themselves as French. The people living in southern France spoke a language closer to what was spoken in Barcelona than what was spoken in France. We think of, France, the state of the French. Forget, of course, we have minority groups also in France. Why did they come to think of themselves as French? Because over centuries, a territory was knit together and an educational system was developed and people started coming together on common causes, sometimes because of being attacked from outside. And they came to think of themselves as French. So French isn't just a category. France isn't just a category. These are geographical expressions that we need to understand as actually interrelated in the way that they come into being. And that's an example at the state scale of what I was looking at the sub-state scale in Belgium.
아까 그 시간 거리 지도가 굉장히 재미있으셨다고 이야기를 하세요. 그래서 저희 이 강의 끝나고 나서 저희 Great Geographic Society 저희 1주년 기념 행사가 있어서 저희가 조금 더 여기를 쓸 거거든요. 그래서 그때 오셔서 조금 더 구체적으로 안내를 받으시면 어떨까요? 네네. 아, 예.
밑에 숫자가 의미하는 거하고 D라고 써져 있거든요.
네네.
그게 뭘 의미하는지 설명해 주시면 다들 같이 보았던 지도라서.
다시 한번 그 슬라이드를 좀 띄워달라는 말씀이신 것 같거든요.
1부터 36까지의 숫자가 있고 나머지에는 이제 D가 붙어요.
So she asked about the meaning of the world map, and then it tells about the hours of traveling.
Oh, yes.
So she needs a more detailed explanation about the map.
So the darker the red, the darker the color, the farther you are from more major cities. How long it takes to travel to major cities. So the yellow area is the very interconnected world. The darker area is the less interconnected world.
그러니까 이런 거 같은데요. 이거는 2 days, 3 days, 4 days, 5 days, 10 days. 그러니까 이렇게 아주 진한 색깔, 여기는 이제 10일 걸리는 거죠. 여행 가려면. 그렇게 표현된 지도입니다.
타임이라는 얘기신가요? 시간? 저기 0부터 36까지.
네, 이거는 hour인 것 같고요. 네, hour. 그리고 10 days. 그러니까 열흘이 걸리는 것이다. 이렇게 지도가 보여주고 있는 것 같습니다. 이게 도대체 무엇을 의미하는지 문법을, 그래머를 물어보신 거잖아요. 그죠? 어떤 지도를 읽는 문법을, 그죠? 네, 그래서 지도를 우리가 볼 수도 있지만 읽을 수도 있고 또 어떻게 읽어내느냐. 우리가 책도 마찬가지잖아요. 책을 보는 사람도 있고 읽고 해석하고 성찰해서 삶으로 끌어내는 사람이 있잖아요. 지도도 마찬가지인 거예요. 그래서 오늘 처음 이렇게 지도에 관련해서 저는 질문을 받은 게 사실 처음이에요. 그래서 너무나 반갑고 이 지도를 읽으려고 노력하는 분을 만나서 청중에서 너무 좋습니다.
One chapter for artificial intelligence area.
Yeah, thank you. Those are great questions. So, first of all, there has been, I think in an age of specialization particularly, there's been a tendency even within geography, academic geography, to increasingly divide physical and human geography. I've resisted this, even though I recognize sometimes we need in-depth studies of people who really can understand the physical environment in a deep way and understand aspects of the human environment in a deep way. But I've resisted this because I think we often are missing in really important places where there is overlap. And it's a challenge, I think, right now in an age of specialization. But I think given, for example, all the environmental problems that we see around us, there's a beginning to be, even within academic geography, a pushback towards more people who can operate in this at the intersection of the two. Because it is quite critical. So I've been a champion, maybe a little bit facing the wind, of not losing sight of what geography can bring. Because you're right, geography is an interdisciplinary subject in a way, but we share, one of my closest colleagues in my department is a climatologist, but we share a way of thinking about space and place that actually we have a lot to say to each other. And I think it's important we don't lose sight of that. On AI, if I were writing the book now, of course, yes. I mean, it's a critically important, I think, a globally changing circumstance that nobody was talking about when I wrote this book a few years ago. And there are important ways I think geography can and must contribute to the whole way in which AI is changing the world. I'm only at the beginning of thinking about this. We need younger folks who than doing this. But just a few examples range everything from the employment impacts of AI and how geographic analysis can maybe help us understand the winners and losers in those areas. We can think about the incredible energy needs of the data processing centers. These have incredibly energy intensive, these data processing centers. And this is going to have big environmental impacts that we sort of need to take into consideration as well. And then, of course, just because I'm interested in geographic education, I'm interested in education generally. What does this mean for how we teach students, for what they can be asked to do? And I'm very concerned, actually, about students losing the experience of doing some research on their own and writing it up, because you learn as you research and write rather than just having ChatGPT generate something for you, even if you can critique it. So I think it's an absolutely transformational moment. And the publishers already asked me about a second edition of this book. I said, I will consider it maybe in a year or two after I have a little more time to think about these things. So thank you.
어렸을 때 저는 지리에 대해서 전혀 이제 관심이 없었는데 역사나 이제 정치에 좀 관심을 가지면서 이제 보니까 지도가 엄청 필요하다는 걸 느꼈어요. 그래서 도서관에 온 이후도 이제 이런 지도가 있을까? 저희가 이제 사실 지도를 정확한 왜곡되지 않은 지도를 접하기가 엄청 힘들잖아요. 네, 그래서 도서관이라는 이런 곳에 와서 좀 이제 찾아보려고 했는데 사실 또 그렇게 이제 없더라고요. 자료가 제가 이제 알아보기로는. 그래서 저희가 뭐 온라인으로 이렇게 찾는 방법도 있겠지만 사실 왜곡되지 않는 그런 좀 검증된 그런 지도를 찾는 게 너무 어렵고 시간도 많이 걸리고, 만약에 이렇게 저희가 어떤 문제 해결을 위해서 이런 문제 해결에 필요한 지도를 찾아보려고 했었을 때 그거에 맞는 지도를 어떻게 찾아야 되는지 이런 것도 좀 조언해 주시면 좀 감사할 것 같습니다.
So, 제가 대답하는 게 좋을까요? 우리 머피 교수님께 여쭤보면 좋을까요?
아니, 답만 드릴 수 있어요.
So how can you find the good maps? Would you give us the good way to find the good maps relevant in some issues, for example? How do you find the map?
Well, I think it depends on what you're looking for. I mean, if I draw maps sometimes from academic articles, so about half of the maps I was showing come from studies that have been done by academic geographers. You can find these, the way I find them usually is using Google Scholar on a topic I'm interested in. And then in the Google Scholar, I can get access to things that have been written, and I can go and look at maps and figures that have done. I get some of them by a couple of my examples were from colleagues whom I know what they're working on, and we're sharing ideas. So that I know that doesn't help you, but that's another way. But then I obviously just looking, online now makes things much easier than it used to be. But looking for Google Images, but with a critical view towards Google Images. So if I want a map of something and I go into Google Images and what I'm looking for, like inequality in Korea or something like that, and I will get a whole bunch of things, some of which are not very good at all, and then you just have to use a bit of critical judgment. For historical maps in the US, there are a couple of excellent collections, actually, for historical maps. I'm sure there's some equivalents here in Korea for this part of the world. University of Texas has an incredible online database of historical maps, which you can access. Library of Congress now, the biggest library in the United States, similarly has some resources, as does actually the Yale University has a major historical map collection, which again, much of this is available online. So sometimes going to, maybe starting with a search for websites that will tell you where collections are, and then going into the collection and drilling down to what you're particularly interested in can get you what you want.
기본적으로 구글맵 스칼라를 추천해 주셨고요. 또 역사 지도 같은 경우에는 또 대학이나 또 텍사스 쪽이 지리 쪽에 강한 주거든요. 그래서 텍사스에 굉장히 좋은 맵들이 많이 있다라는 말씀을 주셨고, 예일대도 그 고지도가 굉장히 좋다. 우리 지금 이 국립도서관에도 맵 컬렉션이 있는 걸로 알고 있어요. 근데 이제 역사적인 지도는 사실 굉장히 좋은 게 많이 남아 있는데, 사실 지도의 또 생명은 업데이트거든요. 그리고 지도가 돈입니다. 사실은 공간 정보가 돈입니다. 그래서 정말 좋은 지도 구하려면 돈을 지불을 해야 되고요. 제가 개인적으로 미디어에서 가장 좋은 지도를 만드는 곳은 BBC입니다. BBC 지도, BBC has a good map, right? 굉장히 지도를 잘 그려요. 복잡하지 않고 그 문제의 사태를 잘 보여주는 지도. 반면 CNN이나 이런 데 좀 지도 별로고요. 아까 보셨잖아요. CNN에 그 지도 엉터리 나온 거. 그리고 한국은 여러분 앞으로 한국에 한번 지도를 세계는 지금이나 이런 데 보시면요. 너무 지도의 수준이 떨어집니다. 정말 부끄러울 정도로 잘못된 지도가 너무 많아서 제가 그걸 논문까지 썼어요. 그래서 이런 이제 좋은 지도가 무엇인지에 대한 정말 그런 것부터 시작을 해서 우리가 함께 우리 지리적 문해력을 좀 높이고, 아까 geographically enable world가 되도록, 우리 그런 나라가 되도록 같이 노력하면 좋겠습니다. 네, 좋은 질문 감사합니다.
강연 이제 마치는 알렉산더 모피 교수님께 감사하다고.
네, 박수 한번. 네, 수업 시간 그만됐습니다. 네.